I guess this story starts at Eric's place, his garage, to be specific. It's not exactly the kind of place you'd find in a glossy magazine, a little too cluttered for that, but it had its own kind of charm. There were tools scattered across the workbench, a box of mismatched screws sitting precariously on the edge, and a layer of dust that no amount of sweeping seemed to fully get rid of. Still, it was a space where things happened. Eric was always in the middle of some project or another, fixing an engine, building a bookshelf, trying to reinvent the wheel, for all I knew. This time, it was his old dirt bike. We were supposed to be fixing it, though it felt more like a prolonged exercise in trial and error. Eric had been at it for weeks now, promising it would run any day, though it had yet to even sputter. He was crouched next to the bike, cursing under his breath as he fiddled with a particularly stubborn bolt. "Hand me the ratchet," he said, his tone curt but not unkind. I grabbed it from the bench and passed it to him, my fingers smudged with grease from handling tools all evening. "Here," I said, watching as he immediately put it to work. He had that look of intense focus he always got when he was deep into a project, like the whole world could be on fire around him and he wouldn't notice. It made me wonder sometimes how we'd even become friends. Eric was all action, while I spent most of my time overthinking everything. The garage door creaked open, pulling me out of my thoughts. I looked up instinctively, and there she was, Amelia, Eric's mom. "Hey boys," she said, stepping inside with a plate of sandwiches balanced effortlessly in one hand. "You eating, or is this another one of those nights you forget food exists?" Amelia had this way of making an entrance, even when she wasn't trying to. She wasn't your typical mom, if that makes sense. She was in her late 30s, but you wouldn't guess it just by looking at her. There was something youthful about her, not just in the way she looked, though she certainly didn't look her age, but in her energy. She carried herself with this effortless confidence, like she belonged in any room she walked into. Eric barely looked up from the dirt bike. "We'll eat later," he muttered, his voice distracted. Amelia said, arching an eyebrow. Then her gaze shifted to me, and I felt it like a spotlight. "Jim," she said, her tone softening just slightly, "you're not skipping meals, are you?" It wasn't just the question that threw me, it was the way she said it. Like she was genuinely concerned, like it mattered to her whether or not I'd eaten. I tried to play it cool, but there was something about the way she looked at me that made it hard to think straight. "No, ma'am," I said, grabbing a sandwich to prove my point. Her lips curved into a small smile, one that felt almost personal. "Good," she said, her voice warm and teasing. "Gotta keep your strength up." Then she winked, a quick, playful thing, but it hit me like a jolt. I laughed it off, trying not to let on how much that one little gesture had gotten under my skin. But the truth? It had. Amelia had this way of making you feel seen, like you were the only person in the room even when you weren't. It was disarming, to say the least. And it wasn't just her looks, though, let's be honest, she was beautiful in a way that felt completely out of reach. It was her presence. She had this way of making every interaction feel significant. Eric finally broke the silence, reaching for a sandwich with grease-streaked fingers. "Thanks, Mom," he said around a mouthful of food, clearly more focused on his project than on anything else. Amelia leaned against the doorframe, watching him with a mixture of affection and exasperation. Her dark hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, a few strands escaping to frame her face. There was a faint streak of flour on her cheek, probably from whatever she'd been baking earlier. It was such a small thing, but it made her seem almost softer somehow, more real. "Don't stay up too late, okay?" she said, her gaze flicking between the two of us. "And don't forget to lock up when you're done." Eric waved her off, not even looking up. Yeah, got it." She shook her head, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Then she turned and walked out, leaving behind the faintest trace of her perfume and an emptiness I couldn't quite explain. I stared after her for a second too long, my thoughts a tangled mess. "Dude," Eric said, snapping me out of it. "Pass me the wrench, will you?" "Yeah, sure," I said, handing it to him without really thinking. My mind wasn't on the bike anymore. Instead, I kept replaying that brief exchange in my head, the way Amelia's eyes had locked onto mine, how her smile had felt like it was meant just for me, and that damn wink. It wasn't a big deal. Probably. But somehow, it didn't feel like nothing either. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but it was like my brain refused to let go of her. I found myself glancing toward the garage door, half expecting, or maybe hoping, that she'd come back. Of course she didn't. And even if she had, what would I have done? Nothing. That was the answer. Nothing, because she was Eric's mom. Still, there was a part of me that couldn't help wondering what it was about her that got under my skin so easily. Wondering why a single wink had the power to throw me so completely off balance. Wondering if she even realized the effect she had on people, or if it was just me. "Earth to Jim," Eric said, snapping his fingers in front of my face. "You gonna help me or just stand there daydreaming?" "Sorry," I said quickly, grabbing another tool from the bench. But even as I turned my attention back to the dirt bike, my thoughts kept drifting back to her. To Amelia. To the way she made me feel like I was the only person in the room. And I couldn't help but wonder what that meant, and what I was supposed to do about it. A couple of weeks later, Eric invited me over for a barbecue. His house wasn't anything fancy, just a one-story place with a backyard that felt like it had seen every summer since the dawn of time. There was a rusted swing set in one corner, half covered by creeping vines, and a patio table with mismatched chairs that looked like they'd been picked up at a yard sale. Still, there was something cozy about it. It felt lived in, like a place where memories were made. Eric's dad wasn't around much. He worked out of state, something Eric didn't talk about unless you pressed him. So, it was usually just him and his mom, Amelia. And if I'm being honest, she was half the reason I said yes to coming over. Not that I'd admit that to anyone. When I got there, the backyard was already buzzing with that barbecue vibe, smoke rising from the grill, the scent of sizzling burgers in the air, and Eric tinkering with a speaker that refused to cooperate. "Stupid thing," he muttered, giving it a sharp slap. "It worked fine yesterday." I laughed, dropping into one of the lawn chairs. "Maybe it doesn't like your taste in music." "Yeah, right," Eric shut back, fiddling with the volume knob. "Like you have room to talk." Before I could respond, Amelia's voice cut through the air. "Hey, Jim," she called out from the grill, her tone as warm as the sun overhead. She was holding a spatula in one hand and waving it at me like it was a magic wand. "Come help me out over here." I hesitated for a second, glancing at Eric to see if he cared. He didn't even look up, too busy wrestling with the speaker. So I stood and made my way over, trying not to feel weird about it. Amelia was wearing a simple sundress, but hair tied back in a loose braid that hung over one shoulder. She had a streak of flour on her arm, like she'd been baking earlier, and her smile was the kind that made you forget whatever you were worrying about. "Here," she said, handing me a plate stacked with burger buns. "Toast these for me, would you?" "Sure," I said, taking the plate. I turned toward the grill, grateful for the excuse to focus on something other than her. As I worked, she stayed nearby, flipping burgers with practiced ease. "So," she said after a moment, her tone light, "how's school?" "It's fine," I said, not really sure what else to say. "Just fine?" she teased, glancing at me out of the corner of her eye. I shrugged, feeling a little self-conscious. "I mean, it's school, nothing too exciting." She laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "Fair enough. What about after school? Got any big plans?" That question caught me off guard. Most adults asked stuff like that just to make conversation, but Amelia's tone was different. She actually sounded like she cared about my answer. I'm not sure yet," I admitted, flipping a bun over. "Maybe college, or a trade school. I haven't really decided." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You've got time to figure it out, but whatever you do, I think you'll do great." "Thanks," I said, feeling a little embarrassed by the compliment. Amelia tilted her head, studying me like she was trying to see something beneath the surface. "You've got a good head on your shoulders," she said after a moment. "Eric could learn a thing or two from you." I chuckled nervously, shaking my head. "Nah, Eric's got his own thing going. He's good at projects." That made her laugh again, and I couldn't help but smile at the sound. "You're humble," she said, her voice softer now. "I like that." I didn't know what to say to that. Compliments like that weren't exactly something I was used to, especially from someone like her. So I just smiled and kept toasting the buns, pretending I wasn't hyper-aware of every word she said. But inside, my heart was pounding. I mean, it's not every day your best friend's mom says something like that to you. For a moment, we worked in silence, the sound of sizzling meat and Eric's occasional curses filling the air. I glanced over at her when I thought she wasn't looking, noticing the way the sunlight caught in her hair, the way she moved with this effortless grace that made everything she did seem elegant. "What's on your mind?" she asked suddenly, catching me off guard. "Nothing," I said quickly, looking back at the grill. She gave me a knowing smile, like she didn't quite believe me but wasn't going to push it. "Well, whatever it is, don't overthink it," she said lightly. "Sometimes the best answers come when you stop looking for them." Her words stuck with me, even after she turned her attention back to the burgers. It was such a simple thing to say, but it felt like it carried weight, like it was meant for more than just the moment. Eric finally joined us a few minutes later, the speaker in his hands and a triumphant grin on his face. "Got it working," he announced, setting it down on the patio table. "Great," Amelia said, her tone dry but affectionate. "Now help me set the table." Eric groaned but did as he was told, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I finished toasting the buns, my hands working on autopilot, while my mind replayed the conversation I just had. Amelia had this way of making you feel seen, like you weren't just some kid tagging along with the son, but someone who mattered. It was disarming, and I wasn't sure what to do with it. Part of me wanted to brush it off, to pretend it didn't mean anything. But another part, one I wasn't ready to admit to, hoped it did. Over the next few months, I found myself at Eric's place more often than usual. It was subtle at first, another afternoon here, an extra hour there. Eric and I would tinker with the dirt bike, watch movies, or challenge each other to video games. But it wasn't just about hanging out with Eric anymore. A part of me, one I didn't want to examine too closely, was always hoping to see Amelia. She had this way of drifting into the room like she belonged there, which of course she did. Sometimes she'd ask if we needed snacks or drinks, other times she'd just stop to chat. And then there were the times when she asked me for help with something, a light bulb that needed changing, a box too heavy for her to lift. Every time, I'd feel her presence so acutely, like the air around her was charged. One night, Eric and I were sprawled out on the couch, watching some action movie he'd insisted was a classic. Halfway through, he was out cold, snoring like a chainsaw, his head tilted at an awkward angle. I stifled a laugh, glancing over at him. Typical Eric. I was just about to leave when I heard footsteps coming down the stairs. I turned to see Amelia standing in the doorway, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. She was in her pajamas, a tank top and a pair of soft-looking shorts that ended just above her knees. Her hair was down, falling in loose waves around her shoulders, and there was something intimate about the way she looked, like I was seeing a side of her not everyone got to see. "Heading out?" she asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound normal. Didn't want to wake Eric up. She smiled, her lips curving in that familiar way that always felt personal. "He could sleep through a tornado," she said, her voice warm and slightly amused. I chuckled softly. "Yeah, no kidding." For a moment, neither of us said anything. The room was quiet except for the low hum of the TV and Eric's soft snores. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was charged, like there was something hanging in the air between us, waiting to be acknowledged. "You're a good friend to him," she said finally, her voice softer now. "And a good guy, period." The way she said it made my chest tighten, like the words were wrapping around my ribs. "Thanks," I said, scratching the back of my neck. "That means a lot." She took a step closer, her bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. Her eyes met mine, and there was something in her gaze I couldn't quite name. "I mean it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're mature for your age. Thoughtful. It's refreshing." My throat felt dry. I didn't know what to say, didn't trust myself to speak without stumbling over my words. And then she reached out, her fingers brushing against my arm. It was such a light touch, barely there, but it might as well have been a bolt of electricity. My skin burned where her fingers had been, and my whole body seemed to go still, hyper-aware of every inch of space between us, or the lack of it. "Jim," she said, and the way my name sounded on her lips made my heart race. Her voice was soft, hesitant, like she was walking a tightrope between what she wanted to say and what she knew she shouldn't. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but," she trailed off, her words hanging in the air, unfinished. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the way she was looking at me, like I was someone worth seeing. Or maybe it was the way her fingers lingered on my arm, just enough to let me know she hadn't pulled away. Whatever it was, I leaned in, closing the distance between us. Our lips met, and for a moment, the world fell away. It wasn't a big, dramatic kiss, not the kind you see in movies. It was soft, hesitant, like we were both testing the waters, unsure but unable to stop ourselves. Her lips were warm and tasted faintly of the tea she must have been drinking earlier. When we pulled back, her eyes were wide, and I could see the conflict in them, the push and pull between what she wanted and what she knew. This can't happen, she said, her voice shaky. But the way she looked at me, the way her fingers still rested lightly against my arm, told a different story. I know, I said, though the words felt like a lie. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to care. I'm sorry, I added, but she shook her head. Don't be, she said softly, her voice barely audible. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, the air between us thick with everything we weren't saying. Her hand dropped from my arm, and I missed the warmth of her touch immediately. She took a small step back, her gaze flicking toward the stairs, then back to me. You should go, she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. I nodded, my chest tight. Good night, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond, just turned and walked up the stairs, her footsteps fading into the quiet of the house. As I stepped out into the cool night air, my mind was racing, replaying the moment over and over again. I knew it was wrong. I knew it couldn't happen again. But the memory of her touch, the taste of her lips, lingered, making it impossible to think about anything else. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. I kept trying to make sense of what had happened, to convince myself it had been a mistake, a lapse in judgment. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. And part of me didn't want it to be. A week later, Eric left for a weekend camping trip with his dad. He'd asked if I wanted to join, but I had work and had to decline. Still, by Saturday afternoon, I found myself at his house anyway, helping Amelia rearrange the living room. It was a task she'd mentioned earlier in the week, and I jumped at the chance to offer my help. We spent hours shifting furniture, swapping out rugs, and debating the placement of her favorite armchair. By the time we were done, I was sweaty and tired, but there was a quiet satisfaction in the way the room had transformed. You've got a good eye for this, she said, brushing her hair back as she stood in the middle of the newly arranged space. I just moved the stuff you pointed at, I replied with a grin. She laughed softly. Well, either way, I couldn't have done it without you. When we finally sat down in the kitchen, she poured herself a glass of wine and offered me a soda. The house was unusually quiet without Eric around, no background noise of his video games, no running commentary on the latest movie he'd watched. It's strange without him here, she said, swirling her glass absently. The house feels empty. Yeah, I agreed, though I couldn't help but think how nice it was to have her undivided attention for once. Her eyes drifted toward me, and she gave me a small smile. You're good company, though. It's nice having someone to talk to. I like being here, I said, my voice coming out softer than I intended. She tilted her head, studying me in that way that always made me feel like she could see straight through me. Her expression softened, and for a moment, the air between us felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. Then she stood up and held out her hand. Come with me, she said, her voice quiet but steady. I blinked, hesitating. Where? She gave me a nervous smile, her fingers brushing mine. Just come on. My heart was pounding as I took her hand, the warmth of her skin against mine sending a shiver up my arm. She led me upstairs, each step feeling heavier than the last, like we were crossing some invisible boundary neither of us could pretend didn't exist anymore. When we reached her bedroom, she paused at the doorway, her hand still holding mine. The room smelled faintly of lavender and clean linen, and the late afternoon sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting golden light across the bed and the polished wood floors. Amelia, I started, my voice uncertain, but she stepped closer, cutting me off. You can stop me anytime, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes searched mine, her expression a mix of vulnerability and quiet determination. But I don't think you want to. She let go of my hand and reached up, her fingers brushing lightly against my cheek. The touch was gentle, hesitant, but it sent a wave of warmth through me, and before I could overthink it, I leaned in. Our lips met, and this time there was no hesitation, no second guessing, only the overwhelming pull of the moment. The kiss was slow, deliberate, like the unspoken truths we'd been holding back were finally spilling out. Her lips were impossibly soft, warm, and inviting, moving with a tenderness that sent shivers down my spine. I could feel the slight hitch in her breath as she leaned further into me, her hands sliding up with deliberate care to rest against my shoulders. Her touch was light at first, like she was testing the waters, but as the kiss deepened, her fingers curled slightly, holding onto me with a quiet desperation that mirrored the storm brewing inside me. My arms moved instinctively, wrapping around her waist and pulling her closer until there wasn't an inch of space between us. The warmth of her body pressed against mine was both grounding and electric, like a current sparking to life between us. Every supple movement, every shift of her weight against me, sent waves of sensation through my entire being. She melted into me, her body fitting against mine with an ease that felt almost fated. It was as if the universe had orchestrated this moment, aligning every star and circumstance to bring us here. My hands, trembling slightly from the sheer intensity of it all, moved gently along her back. My fingertips traced slow, deliberate circles, memorizing the curve of her spine, the softness of the fabric she wore, and the warmth radiating from her skin beneath it. Her shoulders quivered faintly under my touch, a delicate tremble that spoke volumes of vulnerability, of trust, of the same undeniable pull I felt. It was in the way her hands tightened on my shirt, gripping the fabric as though she feared I might slip away. But I wasn't going anywhere. I couldn't. The kiss shifted slightly, growing more confident as the moments passed. I felt her sigh against my lips, the soft sound vibrating through me like a melody I wanted to hear on repeat. Her breath mingled with mine, warm and rhythmic, and the faint taste of the wine she'd been drinking lingered, sweet and intoxicating. Time seemed to dissolve around us, the world outside her bedroom fading into insignificance. The only thing that existed was the steady thrum of her heartbeat against my chest, the supple movement of her lips, and the quiet surrender we both seemed to fall into. I slid one hand up her back, my palm flattening against her shoulder blade, while the other settled just above her hip. Her skin was warm beneath my touch, and I found myself marveling at the softness of her, the way she felt so real and yet so impossibly perfect in my arms. She tilted her head slightly, deepening the kiss, and I felt a sharp rush of emotion, desire, longing, and something deeper I didn't dare put a name to. My grip on her tightened, as though holding her closer could somehow bring me closer to understanding it all. The room seemed to hum with a quiet energy, the air thick with a tension that felt both exhilarating and fragile. Every movement, every sigh, every brush of her lips against mine was like a promise that, despite everything, this moment was ours. When we finally paused, her forehead rested gently against mine, her breath coming in soft, uneven waves. I opened my eyes to find hers still closed, her lashes brushing against her flushed cheeks. Her lips were slightly parted, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I stayed silent, my hands still cradling her, one thumb idly tracing small circles against her side. Her presence, her warmth, her everything, it all felt overwhelming in the best way possible. My heart pounded in my chest, and I was sure she could feel it, the erratic rhythm echoing everything I couldn't put into words. She opened her eyes slowly, her gaze meeting mine, and in that moment, I saw a reflection of everything I was feeling. Vulnerability. Need. 1,000 questions and not a single answer. Her fingers slid down from my shoulders to rest lightly on my chest, and she gave the faintest of smiles, one that didn't quite reach her eyes but still held a quiet sincerity. This feels, she started, her voice soft, almost hesitant. I nodded, my forehead still resting against hers. I know, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. Neither of us moved to pull away, unwilling to break the fragile cocoon we'd built in that moment. Instead, we stayed there, wrapped up in each other, the world outside her room feeling like a distant memory. The sun dipped lower behind the trees, casting a warm glow across the backyard, but neither of us moved. Amelia's gaze lingered on mine, and I could feel the air between us shift, thick with unspoken tension. Without thinking, I reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. Her lips parted slightly, and her breath hitched at the touch. "Jim," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but it set something inside me ablaze. I leaned in, closing the distance between us, and when our lips met, it was like nothing else existed. The kiss started soft, slow, but quickly deepened as the tension between us ignited. Her hands slid up my chest, her touch hesitant at first, then firmer as she gripped my shirt. I couldn't hold back anymore. My hands found her waist, pulling her closer until there wasn't an inch of space between us. Her body melted into mine, and I felt the faint tremble in her frame as my fingers traced the curve of her back. "Jim," she murmured against my lips, her voice breathless and needy. I pulled back just enough to see the desire in her eyes, and in that moment, I couldn't stop myself. Scooping her into my arms, I carried her into the house, her laughter soft and nervous in my ear. When we reached her bedroom, the air felt heavier, electric. I kicked the door closed behind us and gently laid her down on the bed. Her hair fanned out across the pillows, and she looked up at me with a mix of vulnerability and desire that made my heart race. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice low and rough. She nodded, her hand reaching up to pull me down to her. I've never been more sure. Our lips met again, and this time the kiss was hungry, desperate, as if we were trying to make up for every moment we'd held back. Her fingers tangled in my hair, pulling me closer, and I pressed her into the mattress, my weight settling over her. Her hands slid beneath my shirt, her touch sending shivers down my spine. I kissed her jaw, her neck, savoring the way her breath hitched with every movement. She arched into me, her legs wrapping around my waist, pulling me closer still. "Jim," she whispered, her voice a mix of urgency and need, and I couldn't hold back any longer. In that moment, the world outside faded completely, leaving only us, two people giving in to something we couldn't deny any longer. The rest of the time I only heard her voice moaning my name. It was a wonderful 60 minutes of my life. As I lay there, the weight of everything slowly sinking in, I couldn't help but think back on it all. The twists, the turns, the moments that felt so right, and the ones that felt so wrong. It's funny, isn't it? How life can change in the blink of an eye, how the simplest decisions can lead us to places we never expected to be. But the thing is, this story, this wild, complicated mess of feelings and choices, it's mine. And it's hers. Maybe we'll both carry it with us forever, or maybe, as time passes, it'll fade into something more distant, like a dream you can't quite remember, but still feel lingering at the edges of your mind. Either way, I had to say it, because I owed it to myself. And I owed it to you too, for listening, for being here as I told it. So here it is, the truth I've been trying to wrap my head around all this time. This was never just about the moments we shared. It wasn't just about the heat of a kiss or the rush of a touch. It was more than that. It was the connection, the unspoken bond between two people who were never meant to fit in the same world, but somehow did. And as I sit here, looking back on it, I don't know where it'll go from here. I don't know if there's a happily ever after waiting for me, or if I'll wake up one day and realize it was just a chapter in a much bigger story. But I'll carry it with me, every touch, every word, every breath. It's part of me now. And so, here it is, my story. Thank you for listening, for hearing me, for being a part of it, even if just for a moment.